Okay, so today we're going to continue in chapter 26 of Matthew, starting at verse 17. And it starts out by talking about the Passover and preparing for the Passover and going to a man's house to have the Passover. And so Jesus is having this Passover feast with his disciples, and during the feast, during the feast, he says that one of them is going to betray him, and and they're all surprised. Will it be me? Will it be me? And and then of course. Finally, Judas asked him if it was him, and Jesus said, "You said it." Okay, he knew it was him. I mean, they knew. But as they were eating, it says that Jesus took the bread and he blessed it, and then he broke it apart and gave it out to the disciples, and he said, "Take, eat, this is my body." Now, in the temple ceremony, in the tabernacle or the temple ceremony, the priests would, kill the sacrificial lamb, and then they would, a lot of people have this idea that they would put the whole animal on the altar to burn the whole animal. That's not true. They would cook the meat that was good, the good meat, and then they would burn everything else. Okay, I mean, it wasn't the meat wasn't wasted. All right, and so this is kind of like when Jesus is doing the bread and saying that this is my body. It's like, I'm going to die, and by eating this bread, you're eating my flesh, which is symbolic of eating the animal that's killed to be sacrificed. You see, it does. The idea of what do they call it? Transubstantiation. The bread actually turns into the bread of Christ. Of course, it's not true. That's not a true idea. But it's the idea that symbolically Jesus is dying, and this bread represents his flesh, as if you were eating the animal that was killed. See how that works? Okay. And then the blood, of course, after he does the bread thing, then he does the wine thing, and then the wine represents the blood, as he says, "This is my blood of the New Testament or New Covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sins." Okay, now the priest would take the blood of the animal and they'd sprinkle it on the people, or at least Moses did, and it's just the idea that instead of sprinkling the blood while you're drinking wine and then the wine is scattered, that kind of an idea, if you get the idea. But it's the new covenant. I mean, when the people made the covenant with Moses, Moses killed the animal, they cooked the meat and had a feast, and then Moses took the blood and sprinkled the blood over all the people. Okay, but anyway, it's all that symbology, that symbolism. Right? Okay. And then Jesus says that all ye shall be offended because of me this night. All right? And Peter says, no, I'm not going to offend you. And Jesus said, before the night is over, you will deny me 3 times. And I think everybody kind of knows that story. I don't want to get too much into depth about that. So then they go to the garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus leaves his disciples to watch on the road, and he goes further into the garden in order to pray. Okay, he wants to be alone while he prays. Now, we read in one of the other books about how when Jesus prayed that he sweat great drops of blood. And this was a period of time when Jesus went through true anguish. Okay, the question is, Jesus is immortal. But it doesn't mean that he can't die. It only meant that as long as he was doing living things, he wasn't going to die. Okay, so the question is, how do you kill an immortal God? Okay, the first thing that, in order to make it possible, is that the person has to allow it to happen. Okay, it's like a suicide bomber, not a suicide bomber, a soldier that's that goes on a suicide mission. Okay, not a suicide bomber. A suicide bomber kills himself. But like if a soldier goes on a suicide mission where it's for the greater good, he's not killing himself, but he's allowing himself to be killed so that others might be saved. Okay, and it's the same kind of thing that Jesus is. Yeah, Jesus was going on a suicide mission, but it's not counted as suicide because he didn't do it to himself. All right, and he did it for the greater good of the people. Okay, so he first of all had to allow. The second thing is that he had to sever the tie with, or sever the connection with life, which is his heavenly Father. In other words, he's got a connection with his Father in heaven. He's receiving life of his Father in heaven, and the only way that he can die is to have that connection cut. Okay, now, and Jesus told a parable about this where he says that unless the seed is cast from the tree and buried in the ground, it doesn't grow to become a tree. You see, Jesus was still just a seed. Okay, he had to be cut from the tree. The tree is his Father, buried in the ground so that he could come forth an independent tree. All right? So, and it's kind of the same thing that kind of happens to all of us. I mean, at some point in time, like I grew up, the tree that I grew up in excommunicated me. I was cast from the tree, okay? And it was a necessary thing. And in one way or another, everybody comes to that, not necessarily being cut off from God, but cut off from something. It's all about being independent of the tree that you grew up in, kind of. Okay, but anyway, so when Jesus is praying in the garden and he's cut off from his Father in heaven, this is when he went through the anguish. This was the greatest suffering that he went through, was that being cut off from his Father in heaven. All right, so Jesus is suffering to the point that he's sweating drops of blood. All right, and the rest of the suffering, so to speak, was a cakewalk compared to that about being cut off from his heavenly Father. One time the Lord asked me if I was afraid of death, and because I trust in the Lord, I told him no, I really don't. I said, but then knowing what he went through in the garden, I said, were you afraid to die? And he said, no, it wasn't that I was afraid to die. It was afraid that I would not come back to life. Okay? That I wouldn't be able to reconnect with my Father in heaven. And that was a very real fear for him, you see. But he overcame that fear. I mean, we're all faced with our greatest fear, and he overcame that fear and was able to bring about the atonement.